Hello and welcome to another 10-ton potato. I'm here with my co-founder of GT Consult, Craig Tarr. How are you, Craig?
Yeah, all right. Just moved office today. Dying. Otherwise, all good. How are you, Brad?
No, I'm good. Tell me, is this the first time you've moved that office?
No, Brad, that is not the first time we moved this office. We moved 2 months ago, but they moved us into the wrong office, and there seemed to be a Palamun factory down below us, which left a rather unpleasant smell in the office. So we moved to a new office.
Isn't Palamun illegal?
One would think so.
Oh, okay. And is this the second time you've moved office?
Yes.
Is it not the third time?
Just the second. No, just the second.
So you've only moved twice this year?
No, well, we moved out of the office into a storage unit, and then from the storage unit into the office, and then to the next office now.
Okay, thanks for that. If
Who needs Jim?
If anyone's around in the Cape Town area, we have new offices. Swing around.
Make great coffee here. We've got Uber Coffee on the premises.
Uber Coffee? What's Uber Coffee?
They're a brand of really delicious coffee.
Do you have an app and then they just like Uber me my coffee, or you have to fetch?
No, unfortunately, we have to walk down to the coffee shop and get some, but it's all good.
Good. Well, good to catch up. We haven't been able to do this for a while. We've been really busy. And then I reached out to say, I want to talk about something really important, adaptive cards, because they've been around for a while. And we've had a lot of mixed reviews because I'm like, it's amazing. We should be using it for everything. And then as soon as I chat to the devs, they're like, it's tricky. And so I wanted to dive in to adaptive cards and why aren't they used with everything? What's the problem?
Well, they are technically used with a lot of things currently. Some of them that your end users don't know that they're adaptive cards. So oftentimes if you're working in Teams or a chatbot or something of the sort, the screens are actually developed using adaptive cards, and they're a wonderful technology. The beauty about them is that it builds a card for you that you can use across different systems. So you can use it in Teams, in an email, in Cortana if you wanted to. Does Cortana even exist anymore?
Well,
well, if it still exists, you can still design an adaptive card specifically for Cortana. So it provides you with these rich interfaces for apps that you can then deploy across multiple channels. So very, very functionally rich, but yes, there's some technicalities, obviously. I mean, the code to write one is JSON, which is pretty easy. You can integrate it into your teams, into your flows, into whatever you want. But when it comes to things like actionable messages, which is sending these to Outlook, then it becomes a little bit different.
Not only is Cortana alive and well, you got Cortana Skills Classic and Cortana Skills here.
Yeah.
Even federated search. Widget board. All right. So adaptive cards, there's a lot of options. Why do I love them? Simple. You can have actions on them. So here's an example of one that I've been working on. It's an adaptive card that queries the Microsoft Graph for a risky sign-in alert. So this will then pull back information to say, hey, so the following user has a risky sign-in. What do you want to do about it? And so if it sends as a Teams message to the support team or your infrastructure team or your protection team, and they can then have an action. And so we can just, we can have a submit action and just pump in some code that says block the user, right? I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
But The big question here is, well, what does that code actually do? And if you're using it in Teams versus you using it in Exchange, well, what are your capabilities going to be?
So this is it, right? So say for instance, I don't want this in Teams because in Teams people are usually at their machines and desktops, for example. But I want it as an Outlook actionable item, and I'm gonna bang in an action here. And is it execute? Is it HTTP? I'm gonna execute, and now we're going to add in. How does it take my permissions as an admin to block a specific user on a click of a button? How does it do that?
Well, there are different ways that you can configure this. Now, obviously, if you are sitting in Teams, it knows who you are. So it's contextually aware, can go and have a look through Entra ID and find all your permissions
Yes,
and allow
I
you to
I
execute.
agree. In Teams, it knows who I it knows that, and it can do
Yeah.
things. But from email,
From email, that's a different story. There,
yes,
you need to now go and configure a number of features that enable you to interact via Outlook, as an example. So there's an entire provisioning area that you'll need to go through, and provision where you can provision to certain people, you can provision to out to the general populace if you wanted to. Obviously, for security reasons, you wouldn't want to do that. So you'd either give a specific scope for the organization, or alternatively, if it's something that if you're using this for marketing and you're sending it out to clients and you want them to interact, well, then obviously that has a global scope, as opposed to an organizational scope. But yeah, it requires a lot of configuration there. And if you don't get the configuration right, guess what? You get a blank email, which is
yeah,
very frustrating. And that's probably what most developers have been telling you.
and and I would assume that based on all of that, if you had to send or forward this email onto someone else and they had to action it, they would inherit the permissions because they were forwarded the email?
Well, it depends. So it's only if they are in your organization. Once again, if you forward an action on to someone else who's not in your organization, they won't see the card.
Okay.
So the card just disappears. Now, it's quite interesting that these cards also have a life cycle. So imagine if I am interacting from my Outlook message and I want to see that there's been a response back. Well, that interaction happens on the card as well. And that can bring about some interesting dynamics just in terms of people going back to emails at a later stage and seeing the correct values on them. So there are a number of situations here that you need to cater for when you're thinking about the state of where that actionable message has been. So one of the areas that we've focused on is that we were creating systems for clients where it would create a SharePoint task for them. And like, well,
Sure.
we want to action that message from Teams. Great, awesome. We pump the task into Teams using an adaptive card, and they're like, well, actually, sometimes our people are on the road and we want to action this from an email. Well, that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
So you then need to cater for that scenario as well. And in the case of actioning a task, you can imagine there's very much a state because you've got a status of a task. It might be sitting in pending or in progress or completed, and you
Mhm.
don't want the person to be able to interact with it once it's in another state. So that kind of play you need to think about as well, especially when you're looking at something like email.
Yeah. So as we delve into it, I was super excited, and then the more questions I ask, the more you have to think about every step along the way. So, like you said, there's a life cycle. So that record is no longer a record. That email is going to change because it's linked to a live entity. that has values and variables that change. That's number
Correct.
one. Number two, you have to think about the platform it's delivered on. So email works differently to Teams, and I would assume works differently to Cortana. And I mean, like, that in itself is weird. Like, that's a whole nother aspect. Can we start talking to this to action items? Um, and and then obviously it's got Viva connections here, and widgets boards and federated search. So all of these, federated search sounds like something good. But again, obviously all different permission levels. So straight away out the before we've even developed anything, we have to think about the permission structure and we have to think about the life cycle. So it's immediately more complex than I initially thought. So what is a good use case for adaptive cards from your experience?
So a brilliant use case is where you're trying to present data, not necessarily actionable data, but present data and present it on different platforms. So, for instance, creating a widget to congratulate staff members, and you want to pop that out onto a channel on Teams, and you maybe want to send out an email. Those kind of functions work phenomenally right across any platform. When it comes to actioning messages, then that's really when you need to start thinking about these additional complexities, because they do work slightly differently when you're dealing with the different platforms that you're building the actionable message for.
So we made this years ago. We called it the Infomailer, which is a wrapped HTML email that pulls from data all over the place. And I still think that's probably better than this because it's a wrapped HTML item where this is a wrapper that's pulling from a JSON payload, right?
Correct. I mean, you customize the look and feel. You are restricted to the look and feel from the adaptive card designer.
Yeah.
But yeah, ours gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of the info mailer, because we can pretty much design that page however you want it to look.
Yeah.
But then, when we push it to Teams, well, that's not going to work so well. So
Obviously, I think that works better for Teams, this area. And then here's the kicker: how do you send out an adaptive card? What methods do we have available to us to do this?
So we've got a couple, and let me actually share my screen here and just show you some examples. Whoa, we've got an infinite Craig and Brad.
Infoloop. That's cool.
Okay, so you've already shown the some of the templates, and there's a great site at adaptivecards.io where you can go and have a look at some of the samples, and you can see some of these which are actionable, like adding in due dates and comments and the like, right through to things like showing agendas or flight details. Now, some of these might look quite familiar to information that you might get currently from an airline or something of the sort. So
Yeah.
these are just some of those types of pieces of functionality. Now, the check-in here would probably just be a link, an HTML link to a site. That is still wonderful when it comes to adaptive cards on different platforms. When you're dealing with something like setting due dates and updating to a specific location, or calling a HTTP request to a web service, which is generally how we interact with these. That is where it becomes a little bit more complex. But you can deliver adaptive cards directly in Teams. As an example here, we've got a leave application. So you apply for leave, it provides you with a wizard within Teams. And because it is in Teams, it's contextually aware. So it can pick up my name, my email address. I put this into a little wizard so that I can then go and fill in different types of leave, start dates and end dates. And you can see quite functionally rich in terms of the in terms of the controls that we have in place. Once I submit that, well, then I've got a listener on the channel within Teams that is looking for that submit and
Okay.
continues my workflow. So the nice thing there is providing an adaptive card via Teams and then waiting for a response. The other way is if you are dealing with actionable messages in Outlook, as an example, well, that is not contextually aware. It doesn't know your permissions and the rest. So that's where you bring in a web service and you start driving that interaction. But in doing so, you need to actually publish from your developer dashboard a provider in order to use a adaptive card. So in terms of that, you click on new provider over here.
Sure. Was that the last time you did a provider at ProdCon? When was that? Like
Yeah,
5 years ago?
And you would put in your friendly name, and then what becomes quite important are your provider and organizational IDs. Now,
Sure.
if you get those at all wrong, your cards don't show. And it takes a little while for this to be actioned. So when you go through the process, do this a day in advance. And then start working with the details. But within that, you need to pass through certain target URLs that you allow within that within the scope of this provider. And then, as we spoke about earlier, well, what is the scope? Is this just for testing? Is it for your organization, or is this a global scope? And notice there's some timelines around this as well. So 2 weeks before submission, organizational takes 24 hours to roll out. Test, you can pretty much roll out straight away because that's auto-approved. Capture all your details, and then off you go. Once you start submitting the data to your actionable message, well, then you're always going to have to pass in these provider IDs and organizational IDs. And I'm quite happy showing those because I'm not actually going to create a provider here, and those are all those are created uniquely for every single provider that you
These
create.
are not the GUIDs you're looking for.
No. Now, in terms of that, how we implement is we will generate a adaptive card using the adaptive card designer, which I think you were showing earlier, just showing some examples where you can put in your payloads and some sample data, and then it'll actually show you what your card's going to look like in any of your different areas. So we were talking about Outlook. So you'd go to your Outlook actionable message. You would tie your button to a HTTP request that would then call a web service. And within that web service, you can pass through some contextual information like that it's coming from the specific actionable message, etc., to secure it to some degree. And from that, you can either respond from the message back to the adaptive card with another adaptive card to show a success message, or alternatively, you could leave it as is. But what we generally do is we've got a couple of different cards that go backwards and forwards. So you would submit a card. That would then do the checks and balances in the background and submit you a response to say, okay, this has actually already been actioned. You don't have rights to do this, or you've done whatever you need to do. So yeah, those are two of the ways that we go about using actionable cards. But I'm sure there are many other ways that can be thought of. The easiest way from Power Automate, there are actually actions for Power Automate where you can generate an adaptive card for Teams.
Yeah, I've seen that one. And the experience, though, is a little bit sluggish, I've heard and seen on some videos on YouTube in terms of submitting and getting the response back. We're looking at like a 13-second delay on average.
Yeah, so I mean, for things like leave applications, perfect. It's not there's no specific time constraint around that. But I'd have to give you go and check our performance on any of our web services and
because
the interactions there.
It's bouncing back and forth, and in between it, the bouncing back and forth, it has to go through all of those permission layers and deployment layers, and there's a little bit of delay, which is not ideal. But in for an experience where you would usually have to, say, for instance, get an email and then go through the link and then go to SharePoint and then do something, that's not a bad trade-off.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, for approvals in SharePoint, fabulous. But a lot of those approvals you have in Teams. But the problem with Teams is that the layout is very specific, and so as soon as you want to customize something, you need to use your own custom adaptive card.
That's very cool, I think. But obviously, you use the right different horses for different courses. So you're going to use an adaptive card to, I think, personally, probably more in Teams because it really works well there. And it's a little bit more ingrained. I would go for an info mailer in email because it just makes a little bit more sense in terms of the HTML. But the actionability, whilst you could build it into an info mailer to a certain extent, it is great in the adaptive card, but you are limited based on what you can see and all the information you're going to pull from different areas, right?
Yeah, I think anything that's hyperlinked in an email is fine. Obviously, if you want to now build a form into an email, well, then you're going to have to go with an adaptive card.
Yeah.
And deal with the complexity.
Well, I'll tell you what. If you're watching this and you want Craig to give you a tutorial on how to do the following, like build an adaptive card or an info mailer, hit a comment down below and Craig will do it for you. Promise you, he will. There you go, Craig. Let's see how many people want you to build things.
Normally, you sell me to write a blog on it. I think I actually have previously, but we'll have to go back to our blogs from about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Well, look, the target versions for adaptive cards have increased to 1.6, but 1.6 doesn't work in Outlook. So I think only 1.4 works in Outlook. So there's that.
Yeah.
Oh, and they don't work in Safari, any other mail tool other than Outlook.
There are a number of areas where you can use them, but it becomes a little bit difficult when it's just stick to Outlook.
Yeah.
And stick to the Outlook client as opposed to the web. But they do now display in Outlook web as well. So
as long as it's Outlook web and not Gmail.
Yeah.
It won't work in Gmail, will it?
I haven't tested it. Possibly.
You would need to set that global setting on. And
but once again, that would be actionable messages versus something just published using a JSON card. I'll have a look at those.
Well, wait for the comments. I'm sure you're going to get a tsunami of requests.
Looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, Craig, thanks for educating us, and thank you for going through the adaptive cards. And now I know things a little bit better. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Brad. Thanks for setting it up. It's been a little while. We'll push more of these out more often.
We definitely have to. There's a lot on the Copilot side of things that we actually still got to get around to doing. So, yeah, definitely. Anyway, but thanks, Craig. Have a great weekend.
Brad. See you too.
Bye-bye.